was the history of imperialism in China when the Western imperialist powers wanted to penetrate the vast Chinese market, and the result of which was the First Opium War of 1840. Since long, China had been practicing a closed-door policy towards the foreigners, particularly towards the Western traders. The European traders wanted to penetrate the Chinese market, but the Chinese refused to comply with the request of any European powers. In fact, Canton was the only port that was open to the Western traders and particularly to the English traders. The system of trade was known as the Canton system of trade. In Canton, a group of Chinese merchants had formed an organization known as Kohong Organization. The Kohong Organization imposed certain harsh and unfavorable conditions on the British traders. The British traders wanted to slack the restrictions, but they failed. Since the late 18th century, English government wanted to open other ports in China, and they wanted to continue some negotiation with the Manchu government in China. But all ended in failure, and all the efforts of the English government were just exercises in futility. The Manchu government of China was not at all interested to introduce any trading relationship or commercial relationship with any Western power, and it was a blank refusal on behalf of the Chinese to the English government. Then the English government had adopted a very unique method to penetrate into the Chinese market. What did they do? They would collect huge amount of opium from Bengal, and the English East India Company, after collecting huge amount of opium from Bengal, they began to export them to China, and in no time the Chinese, a large number of Chinese, became addicted to opium. In the beginning, the Chinese traders would purchase opium by giving the British traders some goods like porcelain, Chinese silk and tea, but it was still difficult to maintain the balance of trade. They had to pay huge amount of silver for purchasing opium, and a large amount of silver began to be drained from China, and instead the Chinese began to get opium from the English traders.
Now, opium, as we have pointed out, was known to China since the Middle Ages. And of course, this was known only as an ingredient in medicine. But now the drug became a vice. A large number of the Chinese people became addicted to opium. The first to take it were young men from the rich families, but in the towns it spread rapidly among all men under 40 to start with. All young men, mainly urban, because who had the money, who had the money to buy. Then we have the small shopkeepers, we have the peddlers, we have the officials, the entire army and other sections. The total services sector was greatly affected as a result of this. According to one estimate, there were between 4 and 12 million smokers in China at that time. As a result of this opium traffic, opium trade, business slowed down, the standard of living fell, and public services could no longer work smoothly.
When this thing continued, the Chinese government saw that the opium trade affected China in two ways. First, there was a moral degeneration of the Chinese people, as a large number of the Chinese people got addicted to opium. Secondly, it was disaster for the Chinese economy due to drainage of Chinese wealth. In no time, large amount of opium began to be drained to England, and it was a very profitable business, profitable trade for the English traders. In the year 1800, the Manchu government imposed a ban on opium trade in China. The opium trade in China was declared illegal, but still, the declaration of opium trade illegal or the ban on the opium trade failed to put any brake on the illicit opium trade in China. Statistics will show that the opium trade still went on increasing in China. In 1800, China used to import 2000 chests of opium. In 1840, it rose to an alarming height of 40,000 chests per annum. It was alarming for the Chinese economy. And the Chinese government realized that if the opium trade continued, it would be difficult for the Chinese to survive and face the challenge of Western imperialism. It was at this crucial juncture of Chinese history, the Chinese government called Lin Sheshu and appointed him a special commissioner in Canton. Lin Sheshu took his office in March 1839. By May 1839, he began to take stern measures against the dishonest traders and corrupt officials. On 18th May, Lin had confiscated about 21,000 chests of opium from the British ownership, and on 3rd June, he publicly destroyed the confiscated opium. The British got angry, but then Lin Sheshu had driven away the English traders from Canton, and the English traders left Canton for Hong Kong, situated 90 miles away from Canton. But the British traders did not like the behavior of Lin Sheshu. They were determined to retaliate, and they took time to take action against the Chinese.
One Chinese official who became important because of the Opium War, he was Lin Se-su, and who later played a leading role in the opium crisis. He calculated in 1839 that 100 million taels were being spent every year by the Chinese opium smokers at a time when the government's annual revenue was approximately not more than 40 million taels. 40 million taels, that was the annual revenue of the government of the Chinese government, and 100 million taels, 2.5%, more than double, were spent for the purchase of opium by the Chinese opium addicts. And as a result of this increase in opium addiction, opium smoking, it led to the shortage of silver, and which had a very detrimental effect on the Chinese monetary system. In fact, in 1837, opium represented 57% of the Chinese imports. Thus, there was a huge outflow of silver from China to the Western countries. According to one estimate, between 1828 and 1836, China exported 38 million Spanish dollars in silver, known as carolus. As a result of this outflow of silver from China, the price of the metal inside the country rose sharply. Decrease in supply, so increase in price. And this outflow of silver contributed to disturbances in the exchange rate between silver and copper. The rate of exchange between silver and copper before 1835 was one tael was equal to 1,000 copper coins. But from 1835, it simply doubled. So we have one tael is equal to 2,000 copper coins. Instead of 1,000 copper coins, it became 2,000, doubled, 2,000 copper coins. And the burden of this economic crisis primarily fell on the peasantry, on the primary producers of the soil.
Sir, what is a tael?
Tael is 1 ounce of silver. 1 ounce of silver is called tael, T-A-E-L. The great majority of the population, they had to pay in copper for purchasing goods from the market. They received copper coins for their services, for their labor. In the day-to-day transactions, they used copper coins, but the problem was that for the payment of taxes, they had to pay not in copper but in silver. So for the greatest majority of the Chinese people, taxes simply doubled as a result of this change in the alteration in the rate of exchange. And this, of course, added to the strains on the feudal society of China. And in fact, Chinese society was a society where you have peasant rebellions, peasant outbreaks taking place almost every year. So strains were there, and these strains were accelerated by this change in the rate of exchange between silver and copper. And so we see that from 1810, risings against the Manchu dynasty, peasant risings in different forms, that became more frequent and very widespread. So as a result of opium smuggling by the British and American merchants, there was a problem of authority for the imperial Chinese government, because ports like Canton became the centers of insubordination and corruption. Smuggling was carried on, opium smuggling, despite the ban, despite restrictions. Opium had been going on, opium smuggling had been carried out by means of a vast network of Chinese clients, Chinese comprador merchants, or other agents. And many Chinese compradors, they were eager to grow rich. And they also started investing in the opium business as brokers. Another important development took place in the year 1834. There was pressure from the free trade lobby on the British government. And as a result of this pressure, the British government abolished East India Company's monopoly of trade with China. And that started a process when more and more British capitalists, they rushed to China for trade and profit. In that context, the British government sent William John Napier to Canton as the superintendent of British trade in China to extract more and more concessions. But his mission was a failure. And so they became totally frustrated, and Napier ordered 2 British warships on 5th September 1834 to bombard the forts at a place called Humen. And he arrogantly declared that war between Britain and China was imminent, and that China would have to take the responsibility for any eventuality. The British aggressors then sent Sir George Robinson and then Charles Elliot, again 2 other people, to leave no stone unturned to facilitate the armed opium traffic and frustrate China's efforts to curb all their efforts. So China was faced with a crisis. It was a very grave crisis indeed, and it was this crisis which ultimately contributed to the First Opium War of 1840-42 and the signing of the Treaty of Nanking in 1842, which was the first of a series of humiliating treaties that China had to sign.
The Opium War broke out in June 1840 when an English army invaded China under Admiral Elliot. The Chinese gave a gallant fight, but it was not possible for the Chinese to cope with the advanced military training and modern arms and equipments of the West. The result was a disastrous and humiliating defeat for China. China tried hard but could not fight the British properly, and ultimately China had to sign the Treaty of Nanking in August 1842. And by the Treaty of Nanking, the First Opium War, which is also known in history as the First Anglo-Chinese War, came to an end.
Sir, we all know that the opium smuggling is a very important factor for the opium war. My question is, if there wouldn't have this opium factor, then what would have been the case?
You mean, had there been no opium, would
the war would have taken place?
Whether the opium war actually would have taken place? No, war definitely must have taken place, because the war took place in the context of Western penetration. India was colonized by Britain. Opium was no factor in the case of India. But in the case of China, opium was a factor. China's history was somewhat different. And actually, it was their arch for colonization, for profit, more and more for business, and ultimately colonization. It was this arch which must have activated the foreign merchants, the British merchants, to adopt any method. Opium was important, no doubt, in the Asian trade or intercontinental trade, no doubt about it. But had there been no opium, yes, war definitely would have taken place. And they would have adopted any other means, any other pretext. Because the main thing was not opium. The main thing was Western penetration and ultimate colonization, or if possible, partial colonization. So they would have adopted any other means to achieve their goal.
The Treaty of Nanking was purely an unequal treaty. Why it was called unequal treaty? China had to pay a war indemnity to England of about 21 million silver dollar as war indemnity. It was a huge amount which China had to pay. 5 ports, Canton, Shanghai, Ningpo, Fuzhou and Amoy, all these 5 ports had been opened to the British. Britain was also declared the most favored nation in China. Apart from this, Britain got hold of Hong Kong, and thus Britain penetrated into China, and the Kohong monopoly in Canton came to an end as other ports had been opened to the English. As a result of the First Opium War, the Britain had a stronghold over China, and within 1 year, that is in October 1843, another supplementary treaty had been signed between China and the English, that was known as the Treaty of Bogue. By that treaty, the British had a control over the Chinese tariff system. British decided that they would impose the tariff on the Chinese goods, not the Chinese government. It was dangerous. It was a pure attack on the Chinese sovereignty. Moreover, again China had to declare that Britain was the most favored nation in China, and Britain also secured extraterritorial rights in China. That is, the British consuls had the right to try the British offenders in China. Chinese authorities and the Chinese government lost any right to try any British offender in China, and that was known as the extraterritorial rights. By this, the British government was on the driver's seat in China and set an example of imperialist activities in China. But British activities began to entice the other powers, and the other powers also became interested to open Chinese markets and to penetrate into the Chinese market. Particularly United States of America and France were ready to exploit the situation as well as exploit the Chinese wealth. In August 1844, the Treaty of Guangxia was signed between China and the United States of America. China had to concede certain unfavorable terms and conditions by the Treaty of Guangxia, and the United States of America imposed those terms and conditions. In October 1844, another treaty known as the Treaty of Huampua was signed between France and China. The similar concessions had been secured by France also. Moreover, France got the right of Catholic missionaries to establish Catholic churches in China. So, we see that by this treaty, China entered into a system which is known in the Chinese history as the treaty system. The treaty system converted China into a semi-colonial country, and you noted that I am using the term semi-colonial country, and that I shall explain later on. And as an aftermath of the First Opium War between England and China, America and France also came forward, and they were also interested to have their concessions, and China, being a weak power, being a backward power, had to concede to the demands of America and France as well. All these treaties were unequal treaties, as China had to enter into the unequal treaties under duress and coercion. So this system is known in history as the treaty system, and this treaty system was the history of the beginning of colonialism in China, and China became a semi-colonial country. In fact, tightening grip of Western imperialism loomed large over China, and this was the end of the first treaty system and first Opium War.
Why did Britain impose a Britain and France and the other countries impose a semi-colonial status on China? Like Britain was the first to come, so like Britain conquered India.
I shall
totally.
explain it later on when I shall make a comparison between the Indian history and the Chinese history. But Britain did not impose it. In fact, China was such a vast country that it was not possible for Britain to capture entire China. It was not possible. It was the main reason. And what was the essence of the main essential features of semi-colonial status, that I shall explain in the concluding part of my speech.
So all this opium was coming in only through the port of Canton.
Yes. In fact, Canton was the only open port. In other ports, and that I shall discuss later on, after Opium War, other ports had been opened. Other ports were not open to any Western traders, neither European traders nor British traders and American traders.
But the Japanese, Koreans, these traders.
No, not
could
Japanese. Only Sham, Malaysian, Korean, such traders. In fact, Korea was a tributary state of China at that time. Korea had no independent entity. In fact, they used the system known as the tribute system. Some small powers, Sham and other South Asian countries, they had to pay huge tribute to the Chinese empire, and they were allowed trade. That was in the 18th century.
But why did the Chinese government impose such a closed door policy? Was it due
In
to
fact,
some
that
xenophobic?
is a long history.
Okay.
The Chinese would feel that it was, according to the Chinese tradition, that China was situated in a place which was just at the center of heaven, and they were superior to any other power in the universe. They cannot trade with the other powers standing on same footing. It was the view and attitude of the Chinese. But it was natural. In 18th century, England was a vast colonial power. England would not agree to pay tribute to the Chinese emperor or Chinese government, and they wanted that some balance of trade should be formed, and on equal terms trade and commerce should be made. And this was why they started negotiation with the Chinese government, but the Chinese government did not want. They wanted to follow a closed door policy.
Okay.
And it was the reason why the British resorted to force to open China, to penetrate into the vast Chinese market.
So, but you were talking about the Canton system of trade. So, since when was this system of trade prevalent?
In fact, Canton system of trade was prevalent since Middle Ages, but it became very popular when due to increasing Western power. The other powers who would pay tribute to the Chinese government, they would come and pay tribute, and they got engaged in trade and commerce with China. When due to increasing Western power in the 18th century, Canton system of trade rather became popular. But even before that, Canton was the only open port to the Europeans and the Western powers. No other ports were open to the other traders.
So, why did they even allow Canton to be opened? Was it also by force?
No, it was due to Western pressure.
Western pressure, yeah, that's
It was due to Western pressure.
And what about the relation with Japan? Like China didn't trade with Japan.
At that time, Japan was not a very significant power. Japan also used to maintain a closed door policy up to 1867, up to Meiji Restoration, you know. Now I have just come at 1840. The first Opium War begins. Japan was not Japan was not interested in China. China was also not interested in Japan. Two neighboring states.
No, but Japan used to get a lot of influence, cultural and a
That
lot
was
of influence.
true, but Japan was not interested in trade. China was also not interested in trade. Both
So apart
followed.
from traders, other people could
Yes,
come
yes,
in.
yes. There was a more or less good relationship between the two countries. Not imperialism, but nothing like
Like
that.
missions were exchanged
Ah,
between the two countries.
Yes, yes, yes. Japan became an imperialist power towards the end of the 1890s, and first experiment of Japanese imperialism was against China in 1895, the first Sino-Japanese war, when Japan became, and that was much after Meiji Restoration. So long Japan was not a factor in the imperialist history, Japan was not imperial. Japan also would follow closed door policy. When Commodore Perry invaded Japan, 1853, Japan began to be opened by in other ways by the Western imperialist powers.